They said miracles don't happen in boardrooms. They don't happen in mansions or behind iron gates. They said miracles belong in books, in churches, in stories you tell children before bed. But that day, in a house where wealth dripped from, every chandelier and pride sat heavy at the dinner table. A miracle unfolded, and it came from the hands of the woman no one ever noticed. Her name was Mariah. To the family, she was the Maid, a quiet black woman who polished the CEO's marble floors until they gleamed like glass, who knew how to fold shirts into perfect rectangles, and who could disappear from a room without making a sound. That's how they wanted her, present but invisible, always there, but never part of the story. But Mariah carried stories inside her, stories her grandmother told by firelight, stories born out of struggle and survival. And one of those stories, one of those games, would one day change everything. The CEO, Richard Whitmore, was a man who measured life in numbers, profit margins, market shares, deals closed over cigars in dark rooms. He had built an empire, but there was one thing his money couldn't buy: his daughter's health. Clara was 10 years old when the accident happened. A reckless driver on a rainy night left her body broken and her spine paralyzed. Since then, she hadn't taken a step. Doctors, therapists, specialists from across the country, they all said the same thing: she will never walk again. And Richard, the man who never accepted defeat in business, couldn't fight this one. He watched his daughter shrink into silence. He watched the light in her eyes dim as her friends ran, played, and danced without her. He watched her stop asking questions, stop laughing, stop believing. That was the real wound, not her legs, but her spirit. And then came Mariah. It began with a simple thing, something no one paid attention to. Mariah would sit on the carpet in Clara's room after her chores were done, telling her stories while she brushed the little girl's hair. At first, Clara barely responded. She stared at the wall, silent, broken. But Mariah's voice had rhythm, like a song carried from one generation to another. She wove tales of warriors, queens, and children who could move mountains with their courage. And slowly, Clara began to listen. One evening, Mariah taught her a game, not the kind you buy in a toy store, but one passed down in her family. It was called Rise. It didn't need dice or cards, only imagination and faith. The rules were simple. Each time you tried, you had to push a little further than before. If you couldn't lift your hand yesterday, today you tried again. If you couldn't wiggle a finger last week, this week you focused until it moved. And with each small victory, you whispered one word: rise. At first, Clara only rolled her eyes, but Mariah didn't stop. She played with her, day after day, turning effort into story, turning struggle into game. When Clara's finger twitched, Mariah clapped like it was the 4th of July. When her hand lifted an inch, Mariah shouted as if the world had been reborn. Nobody else noticed. To the Whitmore family, Mariah was still just the Maid. They didn't see the quiet hours in that bedroom, the whispered encouragements, the little girl rediscovering hope through a game born in a black woman's hands. But the change was happening. Clara's laughter returned. She started talking more, asking questions, dreaming again. And then, her legs. One morning, Richard came home early from a meeting. He walked past his daughter's door and froze. He heard laughter, real laughter, coming from inside. He pushed the door open. There was Clara, gripping the side of her bed, sweat dripping down her face. And there was Mariah, crouched in front of her, eyes locked, hands stretched out but not touching, whispering, "Rise, baby. You can do it. Just one more time. Rise." Richard watched in silence as Clara trembled, her legs weak, her body shaking. And then, for the first time in 2 years, she lifted herself an inch higher than before. She didn't stand fully, not yet, but she rose enough for her father to see what no doctor had believed possible. Tears burned his eyes, but pride, stubborn, cold pride, kept him from stepping inside. Instead, he walked away, but he couldn't unsee it. That night, he replayed the image over and over, his daughter smiling, fighting, believing again. And the woman who had given her that gift wasn't a doctor, wasn't a therapist, wasn't a specialist flown in at a price tag with too many zeros. It was the maid, the woman he had never truly looked at. Viewers, pause here for a moment. Think about it. How many times do we walk past people, dismiss them, decide their role in our story is too small to matter? And yet, sometimes it is the very person we overlook who holds the key to our greatest miracle. If you're feeling this, if it's stirring something in you, don't just keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share it, and let this story reach someone who needs to remember the power of dignity, of resilience, of humanity, because this is only the beginning. The weeks that followed turned Clara's room into a battleground of hope. Each day, she played the game. Each day, she pushed further. And each day, Mariah cheered her on like a coach guiding an athlete toward glory. Clara's muscles began to wake. The doctors couldn't explain it. Richard brought in new specialists, and they shook their heads in disbelief. Impossible, they said. Spinal damage like this doesn't just reverse. But they didn't understand the fire inside that child, lit by a game no medical journal could measure. They didn't understand what happens when a person believes again. One evening, Richard finally confronted Mariah. He found her in the kitchen, wiping down the counters after everyone else had gone to bed. "What are you doing with her?" he demanded. Mariah froze, then slowly turned to face him. Her voice was calm, respectful, but firm. "I'm teaching her to rise." "It's dangerous," Richard snapped. "You'll give her false hope." Mariah looked him straight in the eye, unflinching. "Hope isn't dangerous, sir. Hopelessness is, and you've let her drown in it long enough." For a moment, Richard wanted to fire her on the spot. Who was she? A maid, to speak to him like that. But deep down, he knew she was right. He saw it in Clara's eyes every time she looked at Mariah. There was light there again, a light he thought was gone forever. And so he let her continue, quietly, reluctantly, but he did. What he didn't know was how much it would cost. Because as Clara grew stronger, as her tiny victories piled up, whispers began to spread. Family friends noticed. Guests in the mansion began to talk. And in their world, a black maid overstepping her role was not something easily forgiven. One evening, during a dinner party, Clara insisted on being wheeled into the dining room. The guests smiled politely, offering the same pitiful glances she had grown used to. But then, to everyone's shock, she gripped the table with trembling hands, looked at Mariah across the room, and whispered the word they had practiced together: "Rise." And in front of a room full of CEOs, investors, and polished society faces, Clara stood. Her legs shook, her body swayed. But she stood. Gasps filled the room. Glasses clinked as hands froze mid-air. And then all eyes turned. Not to Clara, not even to Richard, but to Mariah, the maid, the black woman who had given this child back her strength. And in that moment, the room divided. Some saw a miracle. Others saw a threat. For a long moment, the dining room was silent. You could hear nothing but the clatter of Clara's uneven breaths as she clung to the table, standing on her fragile legs. And then the whispers began. "She's standing. After all this time. But how?" Richard's guests turned their eyes toward Mariah, as if the miracle itself was somehow an offense. In their world, money bought progress. Specialists, machines, and therapies carried names and credentials. Not a maid, not a black woman whose hands smelled of lemon polish and soap. Richard's jaw tightened. Pride battled shame inside him. Pride, because his daughter had just done the impossible. Shame, because the credit wasn't his. It wasn't the hospital bills he'd paid. It wasn't the doctors he'd hired. It was Mariah, the woman he had never introduced, never acknowledged, never considered worthy of a seat at his table. One of the investors, a tall man with silver hair and a smirk that carried old prejudice, leaned back in his chair. "Impressive trick," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "But surely the girl had some professional help." The room chuckled nervously, as though laughing might ease the discomfort of truth. Richard glanced at Clara, whose eyes still shone with joy, and then at Maria, standing quietly at the edge of the room, neither proud nor ashamed, just steady. It was in that moment that Richard realized the world would try to erase her from this story. They would call it coincidence, therapy, divine intervention, anything but the truth. Anything but the game taught by a black maid whose dignity was worth more than all the gold chandeliers in that mansion. But Clara wouldn't allow it. With her voice trembling but clear, she shouted across the table, "I stood because of Maria." Room froze. No one laughed now. The child's truth cut sharper than any accusation. Maria's eyes filled, though she held back her tears. And Richard felt the weight of his own silence pressing against him. For years, he had been the man who spoke over others, the man whose word was law. But in this moment, he had none. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their glances sharp with judgment. Some looked at Maria as if she had broken an unspoken rule. Others looked at Richard, waiting to see what he would do. Would he dismiss it? Would he protect his status, his reputation, his pride? Richard stood slowly, clearing his throat. His voice, when it came, was lower, heavier than before. "My daughter is standing tonight," he said, his eyes sweeping the room, "because of this woman. Not a doctor, not a therapist, not any of you. Because of Maria." Gasps scattered like sparks. A few hands clapped politely, uncertainly, but most sat stiff, refusing to acknowledge what he had just declared. The silver-haired investor smirked again, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "So, Whitmore, is this what your empire runs on now? Children's games taught by maids?" Richard stared at him, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to win a battle of words. He simply turned, walked across the room, and placed his arm gently around Maria's shoulder. "It runs on dignity," he said. That night, the dinner party ended early. Guests left with whispers and sideways glances, their judgments echoing through the marble halls. But Clara didn't care. She had stood, and in her room later, with Maria beside her, she whispered again and again, "Rise, rise, rise." The progress was slow, fragile, but it was real. Each day, Clara stood a little longer, her legs growing stronger, her hope unshakable. And every step she took was a step away from despair and a step closer to the little girl she had once been. But not everyone celebrated. The next week, Richard received an anonymous letter. It spoke of inappropriate influence, of overstepping boundaries. It hinted that if Maria wasn't removed from the household, certain investors would reconsider their partnerships. It was a threat, plain and simple. Richard sat in his office, staring at the letter, his pride and fear clawing at him. Firing Maria would protect his empire. Keeping her would risk it. But then Clara walked in, using her wheelchair, but sitting taller than she had in years. She held a crayon drawing in her hands. It was of Maria, standing beside her, holding her up. "This is my hero," she said softly. And in that moment, Richard knew. There are empires built on money, and there are empires built on truth. Only one lasts forever. The next day, Richard called a press conference. Reporters crowded the front lawn, cameras flashing. They expected news of a business deal, maybe a new acquisition. But what they got was something no one could have predicted. "My daughter," Richard said into the microphones, "was told she would never walk again. But today, she can stand, and she will walk. Because of one person, not a doctor, not a specialist, but the woman who has served in our home for years. Her name is Maria, and she is the reason we still believe in miracles." The story spread like wildfire. Headlines across the country carried it. Some praised the miracle, others criticized Richard for lowering himself. But the truth couldn't be erased. Millions watched Clara, her trembling legs carrying her forward, whispering, "Rise, with each step, and millions saw Mariah, not as a maid, not as invisible, but as the woman who had given a child her life back. Friends, let's pause here. If this story has touched you, even a little, don't keep it inside. Share it. Let it move beyond you. Because somewhere, someone has forgotten how to rise, and maybe your share, your like, your comment, will be the game that brings them back to their feet. Because this isn't just a story about a child walking, it's about a truth we forget too easily. That dignity doesn't come from titles, from wealth, from power. It comes from the courage to lift someone else when the world says they cannot rise. Months later, Clara walked across the lawn of that mansion, slowly, unsteadily. But she walked, and at her side was Mariah, holding her hand, whispering the same word she had whispered from the beginning. Rise. And Richard, no longer just a CEO, but a father, humbled, stood behind them, no longer ashamed to admit that the greatest lesson of his life didn't come from a boardroom, but from the woman who had always been in his home, unseen, until she made the impossible possible. So remember this: the people the world overlooks may carry the very miracle you've been waiting for. Look closer, listen longer, respect deeper, because sometimes the hands that sweep your floor are the same hands that can teach your child to walk. And when they do, you will understand that miracles, oh, they happen everywhere, even in the quiet rooms of a mansion, even through a game passed down from generations, even through a black woman who refused to let a little girl stop believing in her own strength. And if this story moved you, if it reached a place inside you that maybe you'd forgotten, don't just walk away. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. Share this story, because the world needs reminders like this. Stories of dignity, of courage, of rising, and together we can make sure they are never forgotten.